Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking it shouldn't be strange. I've often made the comment when being interviewed on a talk show that I've always been interested in anything old and weird. And part of that journey, if you will, was back in 7th grade in ancient history class, Mr. Weddle's class. He hooked me with all sorts of things about ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, the Greeks and the Romans. I was just into it, and I can remember sitting there thinking, this is what I want to do. I want to be a crusty old professor investigating all this strange, weird stuff. Well, one day Mr. Weddle showed us a film in class. It was called The Search for Ulysses. That was put out in 1966, and it was based on a book called Ulysses Found by Ernest Bradford. Now, Ulysses is another name for the character of Odysseus. This is the main character, by either name, of Homer's Odyssey. And what this film did was try to search for correlations between the things in Homer's story. Again, very famous story of the Odyssey, Odysseus, Ulysses. He wanted to try to find if it was real. And so the places that Ulysses went, Bradford would try to find correlations to, geographically, historically, and whatnot. It was a fascinating film. Bradford took us to the land of the Lotus Eaters, the Sirens' Rocks, the Gauntlet of Scylla and Charybdis, and most importantly for our episode today, the Cave of the Cyclops. Now, the Cyclops, of course, is a one-eyed giant. In Homer's story, his name was Polyphemus. He was a man-eating giant. Ulysses' men encountered him and were captured. They were trapped in his cave, and he was killing them off one by one until they devised a method to hang on to the sheep that Polyphemus would let out every day and escape the cave. And then they got him drunk, and they plunged a burning stake into Polyphemus's one eye and blinded him. They got away on the ship, and of course that episode in the story ends with the blind Polyphemus throwing huge boulders at Odysseus' ship as they sailed away to their next adventure. But it raises a really interesting question. Like Bradford asked, is there anything to the story? Is there anything historical about this episode, about Cyclops giants at all? Well, let's take a look. Bradford's book and film asked if Polyphemus, the one-eyed Cyclops giant, might have been real. Were there once a race of such giants? It might sound silly, but what would you think if you came across this in a field somewhere? I'll ask the question again. Did the earth once know a race of one-eyed giants? Is there skeletal evidence from antiquity for massive, giant humans? We're going to find out, because that's what we do here. Great thinkers and scholars from antiquity to the modern period have written about the existence of the bones of giants. Classical writers, Greek and Roman writers, wrote about graves and bones of giants on display in various locations. For instance, Quintus Sertorius, who lived roughly 123 to 72 BC, a Roman general, got tired of hearing the claim that the body of the giant Antaeus was buried in the city of Tingis. He was so tired of it that he dug it up. He actually found a huge skeleton, 60 cubits according to ancient sources, which is in feet, around 90 feet. And he was so impressed that he reburied it, sort of to keep it as a sanctified location, an object. Early church father Augustine, again circa 354 to 430 AD, describes how he had seen the bones of giants in a few lines of his famous work, The City of God, specifically chapter 15. He writes, The large size of the primitive human body is often proved to the incredulous by the exposure of sepulchres, in which bones of incredible size have been found or have rolled out. I myself, along with some others, saw on the shore at Utica a man's molar tooth of such a size that if it were cut down into teeth such as we have, 100, I fancy, could have been made out of it. But that, I believe, belonged to some giant. It isn't just ancient sources that report finds of ancient giant skeletons. There are modern instances of this as well. In 1676, for example, Anglican clergyman Robert Plot found a large femur and originally claimed it to be the thigh bone of a giant. Now, he was a clergyman, and so we could rightly reason, I think, that he wouldn't just lie, but that was the claim. Ezra Stiles, president of Yale at one time, circa 1727 to 1795, was asked by Thomas Jefferson about large fossil bones that had been found in places. Stiles actually replied to the president in a letter in 1784, quoting the opinion of his grandfather, Edward Taylor. He told Jefferson about a giant tooth and femur of a man 17 feet tall. Now, there are a couple dozen such reports in ancient sources and many more, again, in modern sources. Many of them by reputable people that we would assume, again, would have no reason to lie, would have good character, and wouldn't just go do that. Is there anything to these reports, these sources? Where did the bones go? I mean, these are good questions, and they take a little bit of thought and a little bit of analysis that is important. And so we need to turn to some other evidence and another way of thinking about such bones. Classical folklorist Adrian Meyer has written extensively about ancient references to the bones of giants and other monsters. Her book is entitled The First Fossil Hunters, and it was published by Princeton University Press. In the new introduction to the second edition of her book, she describes her epiphany, her discovery. She writes, "One day, in Princeton's Firestone Library, I drew 2 maps of the Aegean world on transparent tracing paper. On one map, red X's marked the spots where people had reported the bones of giants or monsters in antiquity. On the other map, I circled the rich deposits of mastodon, mammoth, and other large vertebrate fossils known to modern paleontologists. Fingers crossed, I superimposed the 2 sketch maps. Lo and behold, they overlapped. The places where people had reported giant bones, specifically human skeletons or what they thought was human skeleton remains, in the ancient world overlapped with modern paleontological discovery." Now, the thesis that evolved from all this was that there was a heavy concentration of such references in the classical world, the world of Greece and Rome. Reports in ancient and modern sources before the science of paleontology therefore misidentified skeletal remains of dinosaurs or prehistoric mammals. They thought they were human giants and that these skeletons were evidence of giant races of humans in remote antiquity. Meyer later added to her data in a follow-up book, The Fossil Legends of the First Americans. In this book, her focus was Native American giant legends, and she found, again, similar data, a similar situation. She focused on the Badlands of Montana, which is a vast graveyard of the Cretaceous period. The area was home to the Sioux, the Crow, and the Blackfeet. What did these native people think when they saw these bones of immense animals they had never seen alive? Well, it turns out that those bones became the stuff of legend, literally. They are often what is behind Native American legends about giants, human giants, and other monsters. In other words, they reimagined the remains of extinct mammoths, dinosaurs, pterosaurs, marine creatures, monster bears, giant lizards, all of these things, and they created their own mythology around them. The familiar Native American stories, again, of monsters that people encountered that had meaning to them, actually were, in a way, their explanation for actual skeletons they encountered, but they had no idea what they were actually looking at. So what about our giant Cyclops skull that we saw earlier? The sight of the unfamiliar can really deceive us. That skull looks, for all intents and purposes, like a Cyclops skull. It's huge, it's got one eye. What else would you need? But it's deceptive. Here is the same kind of skull, but more complete. And you can tell right away what this is now. This is not a Cyclopean giant. This is a Proboscidean, probably a new term for you. This is a giant mammoth or a mastodon skull. Modern elephant skulls would look much the same way. If you remove the tusks, they look like Cyclops skulls. It's very easy to imagine how someone coming across a skull like that, or this second example, if you took the tusks away and you just had the head, that would look like a Cyclops. It's very easy to see how legends of one-eyed giants could arise and work their way into books like Homer's Odyssey. Very understandable. Here's something a little bit different. Here we have an upright, grotesque, giant skeleton. Is this a giant human? If you came across this that was relatively complete in a field somewhere, or dug it up, or found it in a cave, it would be very easy, again, to look at this and think, wow, we've just found a giant human skeleton. But that's not what this is. That's actually a giant sloth. The femur bones that you often see on the internet are typically touted as evidence of giant human remains. But when we look at the femurs of a giant sloth or a woolly mammoth or any other giant prehistoric mammal, their femur bones look remarkably like a human femur, except they're just so much bigger. If you have an idea of the scale of a giant prehistoric mammal, some of these specimens that we've talked about and others, again, it would be very easy to see how an ancient person or even a modern person living in an era before there was paleontology, before these things had been really studied scientifically, be quite understandable to mistake these sorts of skeletal remains for giant humans. People aren't trying to be deceptive here. They're not lying. These ancient and early modern reports that we read are true. This is what people really thought they were looking at. But looking again in hindsight at some of these materials, especially when the stories, the encounters overlap with where prehistoric remains have been found, we have a very good working explanation for a lot of these reports of ancient giants. Now, you may come across some websites that claim no examples of giant skeletons found in North America, for instance, turned out to be a mastodon or a mammoth. That would simply be wrong. It really depends on where you look. We try to focus here at Fringe Pop 321 on peer-reviewed literature. One example in the case of our episode currently is James L. Hayward, Fossil Proboscideans and Myths of Giant Men, written in 1984 as part of the Transactions of the Nebraska Academy of Sciences and Affiliated Societies. This is freely available online. In fact, we have it listed for this episode on our Fringe Pop 321 website. I should say before we conclude that this really isn't an either-or question. No unusually tall ancient people on one side versus whole races. We don't have to pick between those two options. There were certainly tall people who lived in antiquity, very tall people. The Bible records some of these examples. Other ancient literature actually does as well. Tall people have lived at all times. Classical, biblical, ancient sources do refer to them. And the same can be said for modern sources as well. Archaeologists find giant human remains from time to time, but what we're talking about there are giants like we would think of today. A specimen that would be 6 to 8 feet in range. Think of the NBA and you have the picture. The point for this episode instead is not, again, to deny that there is such a thing as a giant human, okay, or that people writing in the ancient world would have been totally mistaken every time. Our point is that a lot of these reports are misidentifications, but we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There are clear cases of misidentification, but there are also clear cases where this wouldn't be very abnormal. It's not abnormal today. Why would we expect antiquity to have no specimen at all of a very large, very tall human being? We wouldn't. It's reasonable. Thanks again for watching, and please visit our website for show notes and sources, because what you know may not be so.